Will your retirement be great, or will it just be 20 to 30 years of unemployment? Social Security can help as long as you get it right. Visit RealClearSocialSecurity.com and learn how to claim benefits. RealClearSocialSecurity.com.
KNUS Denver, a Salem Media Group station. He's a Denver native, born of Denver natives, a former chief deputy DA. He is an active Colorado trial lawyer who has also worked in the media for decades. Bright, independent, and full of fun. He is part of 710 KNUS now. This is the Craig Silverman Show.
Oh, what a day, what a world, what a life, what an interesting life our VIP guest has had. ElSissi Jassers is a medical doctor. He's the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. A devout Muslim, Dr. Jasser founded AIFD in the wake of the 9/11 attacks on the United States as an effort to provide an American Muslim voice advocating for the preservation of the founding principles of the U.S. Constitution, liberty and freedom through the separation of mosque and state. It's an honor to welcome him back to 710 KNUS. Dr. Jasser, thanks for making the time out of your busy medical practice and your Saturday. Thank you, sir. Dr. Jasser? Is Dr. Jasser there?
It's great to be with you, Craig. As always, thanks for having me.
Well, I can't help but think about you. I don't know if you were watching Megyn Kelly when she had that exchange with Bobby Jindal talking about you. Did you happen to be watching that night?
I was. It was on in the background, and my youngest son said, "Hey, Dad, she's mentioning you and talking to this other and to Governor Jindal." So yeah, I did. I was flattered. I don't think he knew who I was, but that's okay.
He didn't. Let me play it for everybody so they can hear it, and you can hear it not in the background but live on the radio. Here you go.
Now, America's got a radical Islam problem. Here's why this is such a silly gotcha question to Republicans. Show me, they keep asking presidential candidates like myself, would you vote for a Muslim for president? Show me that Muslim Republican who's going to be fighting for religious liberty, who's going to vow to destroy ISIS, who's going to fight to repeal Obamacare, who's going to preserve our Judeo-Christian heritage. Show me that candidate, and I'd be happy to consider voting for that person. The reality, I'm sorry?
How about Zuhdi Jasser?
Megan, I'm sorry. Look, I think that a conservative Christian from Louisiana is the best person for president.
There are Muslims who are, if somebody you might like who's a conservative thinker who stands for religious liberty. They're out there.
So my question after that, Zuhdi Jasser, are you going to run for president?
No, I don't have any plans to do such, and I'm flattered and humbled that even the suggestion would come up, and I would push back a little. I think he's right in that we have not been outspoken as a community when you talk about Muslims, as you and I have talked about. But I do think that it's not a gotcha question, actually. The bigger question, the biggest question of the 21st century is whether Islam and Muslims are taking on the greatest threat of the 21st century, which is not only violence and terrorism, but this root cause, which is the Islamic States, political Islam, and theocratic Islam. So while our founding fathers had the same battle, and there's nothing more intrinsically American in this battle, so I think Americans should easily get this as to which Muslims are on our side and which ones aren't. Unfortunately, this conversation has not been having. So on the one hand, I thank Dr. Carson for opening this conversation, which is not a gotcha question, but it's about what is the lens and the strategy that the next commander-in-chief would have. I sort of am getting whiplash in that the current president has spent over 6 years apologizing for political Islam and not addressing the problem. So we've had almost a blasphemy law in America where we can't talk about the problems within the House of Islam. And it really stifles reformists like myself from having a seat at the table. And now we're getting a little whiplash and going too far. And we have to thread that needle and say, you know what, there are, as Megan was saying, there are Muslims who are not only pro-American and share conservative values, but yet are essential to lead this fight that we have to engage and we can't alienate.
Dr. Jasser, you're right. It was Dr. Ben Carson who got this kicked off. Meet the Press on Sunday. Here's what he said.
So do you believe that Islam is consistent with the Constitution?
No, I don't. I do not. I would not advocate that we put a Muslim in charge of this nation. I absolutely would not agree with that.
And would you ever consider voting for a Muslim for Congress?
Congress is a different story, but it depends on who that Muslim is and what their policies are.
Dr. Jasser, what is your reaction to Dr. Ben Carson and what he said?
Well, on the one hand, I can understand a little bit where he's coming from. Who's Islam? Certainly the Saudi, the Wahhabi Islam is not compatible with the Constitution, is in fact direct contradiction. Most Islamic states, if not all Islamic states, I consider the evil empire of today. But within their prisons, within the streets of the Arab awakening, were millions of Muslims who are trying to push back against theocracy no different than our founding fathers did. And I would I'm not sure I understand his qualification. The president, it matters, but the congressional members, it doesn't. I mean, I was an officer in the Navy, and I took an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution and protect our country against our enemies, domestic and abroad. So I would hope we'd have the same litmus test, and this is the problem. We need to have a vetting of making sure there are no Islamists, and I think that's where he didn't make the distinction, is that no, an Islamist cannot be given security clearances and should not be trusted, because just like the Cold War, communists often sided with the Soviets, and they were a threat to our security. In today's conflict, Islamists believe in the Islamic State, and they may have divided loyalties, but Muslims is an identity of all those who practice Islam. It's not a political movement. So he needed to make that distinction between Islamists versus generalizing, saying all Muslims, since many of us are anti-Islamist.
Do you know Dr. Carson, Dr. Jasser?
No, I've never met him nor spoken to him, and I think he's since amended and revised his remarks. If you look at some of his interviews, he says he's been doubling down, but I don't think so. He said he meant those who follow Sharia explicitly, those who are part of the theocratic movement. But, I think it's important that candidates, as they get into this and start learning for themselves and then becoming teachers for the country, that they engage us, and I would love to welcome the opportunity to speak to him and his staff.
Do you think that statement disqualifies him from being president?
No. Listen, the campaign season is long. I think he's qualified them to those Muslims who believe in theocracy. And I think ultimately, you look at the statements Mr. Trump has made. He's made significantly xenophobic statements at times that some would say disqualifies him. And I think part of it is not just sort of a gotcha, but to move on and see how this translates into a policy for domestic security against Islamists, and also a policy in the Middle East. How do we identify who our allies are and who shares our values?
Which presidential candidate in your mind is taking the right approach?
Well, we, as the head of a nonprofit, I can't make any campaign endorsements, but what we have done is fairly across the spectrum graded the candidates on, especially during the debates, on how they've been doing regarding addressing the threats, both in foreign policy from political Islam and Islamists, be it in Iran, Hamas, protecting the state of Israel, and American security. And, I can tell you sort of the ones that rose to the top in the first two debates were Marco Rubio, Carly Fiorina. Actually, Scott Walker did pretty good, though he probably could have been a little more detailed. I think Jeb Bush, we gave him a B minus, because while he was clear on the need to advance freedom, really got mired a bit in the discussion on Iraq. And, I think it's an easy question when you ask about Iraq to say, listen, post-Arab awakening, had Saddam Hussein still been in Iraq, it would have been Syria times 1,000 today, because it's the same Ba'athist evil that would have been there. So, unfortunately, there still isn't clarity about the difference of the world post-2011 and Arab awakening in many of these candidates. I think some of the other candidates, Huckabee and Bobby Jindal, have been clear on Iran and have been clear on the times we're in, but we're still waiting for those that have clarity that will identify Islamism as the problem.
Dr. Jasser, our special guest, he's the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Tell everybody your background. Your family comes from Syria, obviously big in the news. Tell us about your parents and your background.
Yeah, my family escaped Syria in 1966. My grandfather, Dr Jasser, was a business owner and also a newspaper editor that was in and out of house arrest in the 50s and 60s, especially when the Ba'ath took over. And once they had a military coup in 63, he had to escape and left Syria. My father then also left, and after he finished medical school, and I grew up in Wisconsin. Was born in the U.S. I grew up in Wisconsin and was on a Navy scholarship through medical school, and I learned that, really the special sauce in America that makes us the greatest country in the world is not only our First Amendment and its Establishment Clause and our Constitution, but actually the fact that our military takes orders completely from a civilian government. I mean, if you look at why it's still today, Middle East countries and Syria are so savaged. I mean, ISIS, you can't get rid of ISIS unless you get rid of Assad. My family's still in Syria today in Damascus, and most of our family's still there, are dodging not only barrel bombs, but have been close to chemical attacks. And it befuddles me. I've met with members of Congress in the past few months who are trying to tell me that chlorine gas still doesn't fit as weapons of mass destruction in the Geneva Convention. And it's horrific to me. I don't believe we need boots on the ground, but this is so much easier than what we did in Iraq. I mean, you've got an indigenous revolution of a majority of Syrian population, which I wish my grandfather and father were alive today to see, because they escaped. They threw away their Syrian nationalism and embraced American patriotism, because this country gave our family the ability to practice our faith more freely than anywhere in the world. But now they would see that the Syrians have finally woken up to fight the evil of Assad and the Baathists, and have allowed, I mean, if you look at the bombing patterns in Syria, ISIS is not being bombed by Assad. It is propaganda to believe that Assad is fighting ISIS with both barrels. He's actually fighting the moderates and destroying any ability for a moderate alternative to his regime, and in exchange has had what the Wall Street Journal has called an entente with ISIS. So as he's allowed that to sort of fester in northeastern Syria, while he has decimated and created cities worse than post-World War II Berlin or other places in history in Damascus and Aleppo, as millions are displaced. 11 million out of the 23 million Syrians are displaced internally and externally, and you've had almost 300,000 deaths.
There are a lot of names I'd like to run by you and get your short reaction as to what you think about them and what should happen to them. Let's start with Bashar Assad, the current head of Syria.
War Crimes Tribunal, the only way, not only him, Egypt was a little smarter. They got rid of Mubarak and exchanged him for another guy now. We need to decimate the entire military, and it's not only us, but give the ability for the rebels to do that. So Assad is the Dr. Mengele of Syria, but bottom line is his military, his Alawite Ba'athist military, needs to be destroyed.
What about the leader of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan?
Erdogan runs the AKP party. It's the Islamist equivalent to the Muslim Brotherhood of Turkey, as we see letting them stay in power as the Turks have done democratically, has proven his stripes as being an egalomaniacal Islamist who has sided with the militants. We've even seen him siding with the Khomeinists because they share a world vision, even though one is Sunni and the other is Shia. But I think the Turks are correcting and trying to restrain his ability to put in Islamist, hegemonic type ideas. He's even given a speech 6 months ago in which he thinks Sykes-Picot agreement should fall apart. As you see, he's sort of reaching for the Ottoman type memories, if you will, that the Islamists have there, and hopefully that debate will allow a more liberal anti-Islamist ideology to come out of Turkey.
Your reaction to the current president of Egypt, General Abdel Fattah ElSissi?
Well, certainly he's a better alternative than the Brotherhood, but 1 year of the Brotherhood running government did more to destroy the ideas of Islamism in Egypt than 60 years of Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak. And now ElSissi was, heralded in January 1st as being a reformer, and I wouldn't give him that term yet. I don't think he deserves it. I think he certainly was speaking at the belly of the beast at Al-Azhar University in January 1st and correctly told them to to speak out openly against violence, against terrorism, etc., but those are symptoms. The words he hasn't used are liberty and freedom. He's not talked about dismantling the deep state, which is the separate economy that the military of Egypt has. And, you know, I think he's just trying to be a softer face of a military dictatorship. And the people of Egypt, I think, get what's going on, and they reject. There's a triangle of evil in the Middle East. It has one point of Sunni Islamism, the other is Shia Islamism, and the third is secular dictatorship. And I still don't see that ElSissi falls outside of the triangle. He's on the point of secular dictatorship, and he might be more benevolent and certainly a bulwark against the Muslim Brotherhood, but he's not allowing a society to evolve which has critical thinking. He's been jailing and torturing journalists and using draconian means of justice that are not necessarily anything we should be adhering to.
Dr. Jasser, our special guest, he's the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He's also a decorated military veteran. Thank you for your service. What do you think of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu?
I think he has gotten less credit than he should for his ability to identify what the problems are in the Middle East, his ability to maintain his alliance with America, despite the fact that our president has not only with publicly but with open mics and others said things that I think were inappropriate. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, if you look at his speeches to the UN and to Congress, he identified clearly that the world, especially the world with Muslim majorities, is going through a cataclysmic conflict between modernity and Islamism, and he's identified it, and why we couldn't learn from that. I remember I was on Fox, responding right after he finished his speech to Congress, and from a foreign policy perspective, there was so much to be learned there, and I thought maybe that would be a tipping point for members of Congress and others to begin, I think this was last year, to begin to articulate some of the challenges that he lives in the worst neighborhood in the world right now, surrounded by Syria, which is going to be getting soon benefits of the $150 billion we're going to be releasing to Iran because of this ridiculous deal that we have, surrounded by Hezbollah, Hamas, Egypt's tumultuous changes from the Brotherhood and now to ElSissi. So it is no wonder he's had to sit down with the Saudis, and the Saudis, clearly he understands our biggest enemies, but yet from the ideological perspective, but yet they're allies with a common enemy against Iran. So as he said in his speech, it's a Game of Thrones, and unfortunately he has to deal with the kings and others, and I think people don't understand the reality of what it is to live there versus us being protected by large oceans that's divide us from them.
Right. That speech by Netanyahu was on March 3, 2015. I had the pleasure of being in the chamber to hear that speech. What do you think of Barack Obama?
I think President Obama will go down in history as the president which oversaw the largest missed opportunity for helping shape what is going to evolve into an unraveling of a world order over the next 25 years. And hopefully it'll be shorter if the next president's able to see America playing a role. But, he tries to shape his presidency repeatedly as one that was withdrawing troops and yet did not modify that 2007-2006 campaign soundbite and mantra to the realities of the Arab awakening. And as a result, that missed opportunity has allowed that vacuum to be filled by Russia, by Iran, by China, by the evils of the world. And his doctrine, President Obama now is looking at his legacy, and his legacy will be a doctrine which Susan Rice supposedly calls strategic patience, which is an empty doctrine. What does that mean? I call it a Darwin doctrine, which is to allow the most evil, the most financially propped up, the most militarily strong to survive, while the good people, those in prison, we couldn't even get President Obama to articulate Raif Badawi's name in talks with the King Salman of Saudi Arabia and others because of the diplomatic challenges. And yet true leaders are able to both do diplomacy and identify that there are people in prisons and jails. Our own prisoners in Iran were ignored.
Right.
The 4 that we should have had it just goes on and on.
It's a darn shame.
The legacy will be one of a president that ignored America's role in the world, the defense of freedom and liberty, while evil prevailed.
What happens when you hear Barack Obama referred to as a Muslim? What do you think when you hear that?
That's absurd. Here's a man that was in a Christian church of Reverend Wright for 25 years. He self-professes to be a Christian. Now, is he an apologist for Islamist groups? Absolutely. I mean,
but do you think he ever was a Muslim?
Well, anyone born to a Muslim father is a Muslim. I would believe his Muslim father identified him to be a Muslim. But then, religion is something of choice, and President Obama has openly declared that he's a Christian, has talked about his Savior being Jesus, and I think it's a bit of an absurd discussion to say that he's not Christian, since he's never identified as anything else.
Dr. Judy Jasser, it's a pleasure to have you on. Your final thoughts. What should people in Colorado be thinking about these great issues? Ben Carson, their Islamic neighbors. What would be your advice other than to go to your website, American Islamic Forum for Democracy, AIFdemocracy.org?
A couple things. First, I think, we sometimes overestimate the role that world leaders play. And I was disappointed at the Pope this week. I wrote a letter to the Pope. I think religious leaders can play a much bigger role. I would ask people, look at my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. It goes through a lot of these issues, and it was written right at the beginning of the Arab Awakening in 2011 and 12. And then begin to push pressure on academia, on not only politicians, on media, to begin to have this conversation, because as we do, I hope our next president will have a doctrine, not a Darwin one, but one of liberty, in which we advance the ideas of liberty, and through that, you will protect American security, because the unraveling of world order, these are not civil wars that are not going to come here. As we see with the millions of refugees going into Europe, those cancers will spread. The Russias of the world will continue to influence the most evil, as Iran has, and America needs to play a role in this, not with boots, but with influence, with ideology, with the promotion of free markets and liberty, and I would hope that we can push our leaders, whoever they may be, to do that.
Dr. Jasser, it's been a pleasure. I hope we can visit again in the not-too-distant future.
Anytime, Craig. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.